Morning, my son-in-law told me his brother's family was moving into my lake house. I was standing in the kitchen making oatmeal. Not a fancy breakfast, just oatmeal, the way I've made it every morning since my wife passed. Steel cut, with a handful of blueberries from the freezer and a drizzle of maple syrup. It was 7:30. The loons were calling out on the water. I had the radio on low, the CBC morning show, and I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That's the kind of morning it was. Then my phone buzzed. My son-in-law's name appeared on the screen. I won't call him by name here. He's my daughter's husband. And for a long time, I tried to think of him as family. I'll just call him what he is, my son-in-law. Though some days that title feels like it belongs to a better man than him. I answered on the second ring. "Good morning," I said. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He never did. That should have told me something years earlier, but you make allowances for people when you love their family member. You smooth things over in your head. You tell yourself he's just direct. He's just a busy man. "Hey," he said, "so I've been meaning to talk to you about the cottage." I set down my spoon. The cottage. My cottage. The one I'd bought with 40 years of work as a structural engineer. The one sitting on a granite point overlooking Georgian Bay, 3 hours north of Toronto, with a dock that my father-in-law had helped me build the summer before he died. The one my wife had called her happiest place on earth. "What about it?" I said. "My brother and his wife. They're going through a rough patch. Lost their rental in Barrie. Landlord sold the place, gave them 60 days. They've got 2 kids and, you're barely using the cottage most of the year anyway." He stopped there. Like that was the end of the sentence. Like that was enough. I looked out the window at the bay. A kayaker was moving along the far shore, a slow red dot against the tree line. "I'm using it right now," I said. "For the summer, sure. But come September, it just sits there. And they really need a place. And family looks after family, right?" There it was. Family looks after family. The most convenient thing in the world to say when you want something that isn't yours. I didn't say what I was thinking. I've learned over 67 years that the moment you say the first sharp thing that comes into your mind, you lose the higher ground. And I had a feeling I was going to need that ground. "Let me think about it," I said. "They'd need to move in by the 15th, he said, "of August. That was 11 days away. I put the phone down on the counter and stood there looking at my oatmeal going cold, and I thought about my wife. She'd spent 30 summers at that cottage. She'd planted the cedar hedge along the south side. She'd painted the dock boards herself, on her hands and knees, the summer she was first sick, because she said she wasn't going to let cancer take that away from her, too. She died in the March of the following year. The paint on those boards is still holding. I thought about what she would have said. She would have said, 'You already know the answer. You're just trying to find a polite way to say it.' She was usually right about that kind of thing. My daughter called that evening. I could hear in her voice that she'd been put up to it, the way you can always tell when someone is reading from a script they didn't write themselves. 'Dad, I know it's a lot to ask.' 'It's not a lot to ask,' I said. 'It's actually not askable.' She went quiet for a moment. Then they have nowhere to go. There are shelters, there are Ontario Works applications, there are family members on his side who actually have a legal obligation to none of this, same as me. Dad, I'm not being cruel, I'm being clear. There's a difference. He said you were going to be like this. And there it was again. Another thing I've learned. When someone predicts how you'll react to their unreasonable request, they're not being perceptive. They're preemptively framing your reasonable response as the problem. Your husband told you I would object to strangers moving into your mother's cottage, I said. And he was right. I'm not sure what that says about him. She hung up not long after. She always did when the conversation stopped going the way she'd hoped. I didn't take it personally. She was under pressure, and she'd come around eventually. She always did. She has more of her mother in her than she sometimes lets on. I sat on the dock that night for a long time. The stars out here are something else. No light pollution, no ambient glow from the highway, just a full sweep of the Milky Way reflected in the flat black water. My neighbor across the point, a retired schoolteacher named Hugh. No, wait, not Hugh. A man I'll call my neighbor had his porch light on, warm and orange through the trees. I thought about the cottage. What it meant. What my wife and I had built there. Not just the physical structure, but the life around it. The August with my daughter when she was small, building cairns on the rocks. The mornings my wife sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and a library book, and didn't say a word for 2 hours, and we were both perfectly content. The winter I drove up alone after she died, just to sit in the cold rooms and feel close to her somehow. My son-in-law had been inside this place maybe a dozen times in 6 years of marriage. He'd complained, twice, about the slow internet. He'd once referred to the outhouse, which we'd replaced with a proper septic system in 2009, as primitive. He'd never once offered to help with the dock, or the roof, or the wood. And now he wanted to put his brother's family in the master bedroom. I went inside and made some tea and called my lawyer. My lawyer's name is, well, I'll call him my lawyer. He's been handling my affairs since before my daughter was born, a sharp, unhurried man who speaks the way people don't anymore, in complete sentences without hedging. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me at that hour. I had a feeling I'd be hearing from you, he said, which surprised me more. Has my son-in-law been in touch with you? I said. No. But you called the same way you always call when something's wrong. Give me the situation. I gave him the situation. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about him. Then he was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. First question, is your daughter on the title? No, it's mine. Solely mine. My wife and I held it jointly, and when she passed it, transferred to me outright. Good. Second question. Have you ever had any written or verbal agreement, formal or informal, that anyone else has any right of use? Never. Then here's what you need to understand, he said. He has no legal standing. His brother has no legal standing. They cannot compel you to do anything. If they attempt to occupy the property without your consent, it's trespass. I know that, I said. But I'm more worried about what happens later, after I'm gone. That was the real thing, the thing I'd been circling around all evening. My daughter is my sole heir. When I die, this property goes to her. And when it goes to her husband too, in a practical sense. He'd have influence over it if not title, and I knew the way you know things about people after years of watching them, that the first thing he would do is push to sell it, or subdivide the point, or put some kind of rental arrangement in place that would make money and destroy everything that made it worth being here. My lawyer was quiet on the other end. That, he said, is a more interesting problem. We talked for another 40 minutes. By the time I put the phone down, I had a plan. It wasn't a revenge plan. I want to be clear about that. I've never been motivated by revenge. I'm motivated by outcomes. I wanted an outcome where this place survived me intact, where it could still be what it was supposed to be. What I did next was quiet and legal and completely within my rights. It just took some careful thought. The first thing I did was contact the local conservation authority. The property sits within a regulated shoreline zone under the Conservation Authorities Act. I'd never paid much attention to this, because I'd never tried to change anything about the land, but my lawyer had flagged something useful. If I registered a conservation easement on the property, it would legally restrict certain types of development and land use, permanently, running with the title, binding on all future owners. I called the Conservation Authority office in Collingwood the next morning, spoke to a woman named, I'll just say a woman, very patient, clearly knowledgeable. She explained the process. A conservation easement is a voluntary legal agreement. I could register it with the Land Registry Office, and it would limit what any future owner could do with the property, No subdivision, no significant clearing of the shoreline vegetation, no construction within 30 meters of the waterline beyond what already existed. It wouldn't stop my daughter from inheriting the property. It wouldn't stop her from living there, from enjoying it, from passing it on to her own children someday. It would just stop anyone from gutting it, from turning it into something else. I filed the paperwork within the week. The second thing I did involved a different kind of protection. I updated my will with a specific clause. The cottage could not be sold for a period of 15 years following my death without the unanimous agreement of both my daughter and a trustee I named. My lawyer's firm. The effect of this was simple. It meant that if my son-in-law ever decided he wanted to cash out the asset, he couldn't do it unilaterally, and he'd have to convince a trustee who had no financial stake in the decision and no obligation to agree. I also set aside a maintenance fund in a separate account, designated in the will for upkeep of the property during that 15-year period. Property taxes, insurance, necessary repairs, so that the financial burden of keeping it wouldn't be used as an excuse to sell. I did all of this in about 3 weeks. I didn't tell my daughter. I didn't tell my son-in-law. I just quietly made the arrangements, the way you do when you've spent 40 years solving structural problems, not by fighting the forces acting on a building, but by designing around them. The 15th of August came and went. My son-in-law's brother did not move into the cottage. He couldn't. I was still there, and I had made no agreement, and the law was entirely on my side. I believe there were some conversations between my son-in-law and my daughter that I was not privy to. I believe there was some frustration. I kept the ringer on my phone off for most of that week and watched the herons fish off the dock in the early morning. It was my daughter who came up first, about 10 days later. Alone, she drove up on a Thursday without calling ahead, which she hadn't done since she was a teenager, and I found that hopeful. I heard the car on the gravel and came around the side of the cottage, and she was standing there in the driveway looking at the water. She looked tired. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. I said, "There's coffee on." She said, "Okay." We sat on the dock for a while before either of us said anything real. That's one of the things a place like this does. It slows you down. It makes the things you came to say feel less urgent, which sometimes means they were never really urgent in the first place, and sometimes means you find a better way to say them. "He's angry," she said eventually. "I expect so," I said. "He thinks you did all of this just to spite him. I did it to protect something that matters to me. And to you, I hope, whether you know it right now or not." She was quiet for a while. A dragonfly landed on the dock railing, iridescent in the afternoon light. She watched it. "His brother's family ended up in a short-term rental in Innisfil," she said. "Ontario Works helped with the deposit. They've got kids in school now. They're okay." "I'm glad," I said. And I meant it. "You could have just said no," she said. "At the beginning." "I could have just said no," she said. "At the beginning." "I could have," I said. "But saying no doesn't change what happens after I'm gone." I wasn't just answering the question he asked. I was answering the one he didn't know he was asking. She looked at me then, and I saw something shift in her face. Not complete understanding. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The willingness to consider that her father might have seen something she hadn't. "The conservation thing," she said. "He said you've ruined the value of the property." "The property is worth exactly what it was worth before," I said, "unless the value he's talking about was in tearing it apart." She didn't answer that. But she didn't argue with it either. We had dinner together that night. I made a simple pasta, nothing complicated, and we opened the bottle of Ontario Riesling that I'd been saving for no particular reason. We talked about her mother. We hadn't done that together in a long time. Her husband always seemed to change the subject when it came up, and I'd never understood why, whether it was discomfort or something else. But that night, with just the two of us and the sound of the water and the bugs starting up in the dark, we talked about her the way she deserved to be talked about, with specifics. With laughter. With the particular grief that comes from loving someone a long time. My daughter cried a little. So did I. She stayed 2 nights. When she left, she hugged me in the driveway longer than she usually did. I'm not going to tell you you were right, she said into my shoulder. You don't have to, I said. But I'm going to come up more often, she said, if that's okay. That's more than okay, I said. That's the whole point. My son-in-law called me once, about a month later. He'd clearly been working up to it. I could hear it in the controlled way he was speaking, the careful flatness of it, the voice of a man trying very hard not to sound like what he felt. He told me I had been underhanded. He told me I had gone behind everyone's backs. He told me that family looks after family, and what I'd done was the opposite of that. I let him finish. Then I said, the cottage was built by my wife and me. The dock boards were painted by her when she was ill. The cedar hedge along the south side was planted by her hands. The property was paid for by 4 decades of my work and hers. I have protected it for our daughter and for her children someday. I don't expect you to understand why that matters, but I want you to understand that it does. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you could have just talked to me. I did talk to you, I said. You called me at 7:30 in the morning and told me your brother's family was moving in 11 days. That wasn't a conversation. That was a notification. He hung up. I put the phone on the kitchen counter and stood at the window and looked out at the bay. The water was flat that morning, the color of old pewter, and the trees on the far shore were starting to turn at the edges, the first suggestion of September, the first cool breath of it. I thought about what my wife would have said. She would have said, you did right. She would have said it plainly without sentiment, the way she said things when she meant them completely. I think she would have been right about that too. That September I stayed at the cottage later than I ever had. Usually I'm back in the city by Labor Day, back to my routines, back to the world of schedules and appointments. But that year I stayed through the long, slow turn of the leaves, through the first frost that silvered the dock boards in the morning, through the weeks when the bay was entirely mine and I could sit outside in a sweater and a pair of old wool socks and read and watch the light change for hours. I thought a lot about what we leave behind, not in a morbid sense. I'm in good health. I have a cardiologist who is cautiously optimistic about my future, and I intend to be at this dock for many more Septembers. But in the sense of what it means to protect something, to decide, consciously, that something matters enough to fight for it without anyone seeing the fight. My wife used to say that the best things you do in life are the ones where nobody notices until much later, if ever. She said that about gardening mostly, the way you plant something, and it grows slowly, and you have to have faith that it's worth doing, even when there's nothing to show for it yet. I think she'd have been pleased with what I did. The easement is registered. The will is updated. The maintenance fund is set. My daughter has a key, and she's used it 3 times since August. Twice alone, once with a friend from work. She texts me when she arrives, which she never used to do. She texts me a photograph of the water. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what my son-in-law will do or become, or whether their marriage will go the distance, or what shape my daughter's life will take in the years ahead. What I know is that this point of land on Georgian Bay will be here when those questions resolve themselves. The cedars will be growing. The dockboards will need repainting eventually. The loons will still call in the morning, and whoever is here to hear them, whoever has earned the right to be here, through love or through time or through simple faithfulness to the place, they'll find it the way it's supposed to be. That's enough for me. That's more than enough. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately, not in any grand or philosophical way, just in the plain ordinary way that comes from living long enough to watch things play out. My son-in-law made a decision the morning he called me. He decided that because I was older, because I was alone, because I was quiet by nature and slow to anger, that I could be managed. He decided that a man who doesn't raise his voice probably won't do much of anything. That's a common mistake, I've found. People confuse restraint with weakness. They see someone who chooses their words carefully and assume there aren't many words behind that choice. There usually are. What he set in motion that morning. That phone call, that casual tone, that assumption. It didn't end the way he expected, not because I'm a particularly clever man, but because I'm a patient one. And patience, I've come to understand, is its own kind of intelligence. It's the willingness to let a situation fully reveal itself before you decide how to respond. It's the discipline to not react to the question someone is asking out loud when you can see the larger question underneath it. The larger question underneath his call was this: whose is this really? And that question deserved a real answer. Not an argument, not a confrontation. A real answer, documented, registered, permanent. I think about my daughter in all of this. She was put in an impossible position between a husband who saw an asset and a father who saw a memory. She handled it the only way she knew how. At first, which was to try to smooth it over, to make everyone comfortable, to find some version of things where nobody had to be the bad guy. She comes by that honestly. Her mother was the same way. It took her a while to see that there are some situations where the smoothing over just delays the damage, and the only real kindness is clarity. When she finally came up to the cottage alone that August, I think she understood something she hadn't before, not because I explained it to her. I've learned that explaining things too thoroughly to people who aren't ready to hear them is just another form of not listening. But because she sat on that dock and looked at the water her mother had looked at for 30 summers, and she felt something. Some things don't need to be said. They just need to be felt in the right place. The resilience in this story, if there is any worth pointing to, isn't dramatic. It didn't look like courage from the outside. It looked like an old man making phone calls and signing paperwork, but it took something real to do it. Not anger, not pride, but a clear-eyed commitment to what actually mattered, to refusing to let exhaustion or pressure or the desire for peace at any cost make the decision for me. That's the thing I'd want anyone to take from this. If they take anything at all, not that you should be clever, not that you should outmaneuver the people who underestimate you, but that you should know what you're protecting and why. And that knowledge should be specific. Not my property. Not my rights. The cedar hedge my wife planted on her hands and knees, the dockboards she painted when she was ill. The particular silence of a September morning on Georgian Bay when the season is turning and the water is flat and the whole world feels like it's held its breath. When you know exactly what you're protecting, the how takes care of itself, and the outcome, whatever it is, you can live with. I can live with mine,